Welcome everybody to the Annual Equalities and Wellbeing lecture organised by the Department of Zoology in Cambridge. Today we're very excited to welcome Professor Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is a Professor of Business Psychology at the University College London. He's going to talk to us for about half an hour, and then we're going to have a chance to have your questions answered. We've got a panel of people who will put those questions to Tomas. So as he's talking, please type your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll pick some of those and put them to Tomas in the session of discussion at the end. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Tomas. He is originally from Buenos Aires, and he spent most of his professional career in London. Now, at the moment, is living in Rome. He did his PhD at UCL, University College London, in 2003, working on the links between personality traits and intellectual competence in the Psychology Department. So since then, he's worked for many years on personality traits and how they affect individual performance, first in academia, but more recently, he's been doing research on how personality affects career success and business performance. And he's developed a renowned expertise in how to improve staff recruitment and select leaders using insights from psychological research. Tomas has published over 200 scientific papers and 10 books, including an undergraduate textbook on personality and individual differences, which is now in its 3rd edition. He's a Professor of Business Psychology at UCL, where he directs the MSc in Industrial, Organizational and Business Psychology. And he's also a professor at Columbia University in New York, where he teaches on the Social Organizational Psychology degree program. In 2018, Tomas was appointed as the Chief Talent Scientist at Manpower Group, appointed to lead a new assessment center of excellence. And he's also a co-founder of a company called Deeper Signals and Metaprofiling, which uses psychological assessment to identify leadership potential and helps companies improve how their teams function. So if you're interested in understanding how to choose good leaders for an organization, I can't imagine anyone in the world with greater expertise than this man. We're really excited that he agreed to speak to us today on the subject of why so many incompetent people become leaders. Welcome, Tomas. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for that super kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with everyone, even if it is just in the form of pixels on your screen. I have great memories of Cambridge University, spending time there while I was doing my PhD, and then being lucky to get invited onto many exciting events and talks. So I hope someday we can do this in person as well. So yeah, what I'll try to do is what you just heard. So speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, focusing on the answer to the question that is the title of my last book, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders and How to Fix It? And then talking a little bit about what this means for diversity and inclusion programs, or DEI&B programs, and some of the gaps that I not just see, but that often irritate me between common approaches, mainstream approaches that organizations put in place, often well-meaning approaches that they put in place to Oops, I self-muted for a bit, so I don't know if this is my content wasn't good enough or I've been cancelled, haha. And then talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that I see to align D&I with evidence-based or science-driven approaches. So with that, let me start with the main point. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders? And how could we fix this? And note that the title of the book has the word men rather than people. And one of the most common criticisms or answers I get when I'm sharing the views of the book or talking, giving speeches or keynotes about the book is why I didn't just use the word people instead of men, right? And it is not always men who raise this point, but usually men, sometimes less often also women. The question is, couldn't the book title be why do so many incompetent people become leaders? And I think that's a good question because it gets to one of the obvious kind of facts on the distribution of leadership, both competent and incompetent leadership, that inspired a lot of the work and the research that led to the book. I mean, in essence, it is a fact that it's a lot harder for an incompetent person to become a leader or a boss or rise through the organizational hierarchy of any institution if they are female rather than male. And that isn't a problem that we need to fix, even though from a fairness and equity standpoint, it might be justifiable to make it easier for incompetent women to become leaders. That's obviously not the problem that we should be focusing on fixing. But when you look at the other problem, the problem that actually is less controversial and has inspired or fueled a lot of the debate on gender diversity over the past 2 decades, what we can see is that in general, we spend a lot of time wondering why competent women don't become leaders as often as they should, instead of wondering why incompetent men become leaders way more often than they should. And of course, because they do, and when they do, they take on a lot of the places or available jobs that would not just be necessary to help competent women get to the top, but also competent men. And so that takes me to the first kind of misconception that I tackle in my book, which is that most leaders are actually good at their job. This might not be a misconception to you in case you live in this world and you open newspapers and you follow the media and you live in one of the 70 or 75% of the world's countries that either include failed states or have leaders in charge, democratically elected or not, with popularity ratings under 35 or 40%. But still, in general, at least within the study of organizational psychology and management sciences, and mostly if you read business publications, trade publications, management publications, or if you go to a business school and do an MBA, the study of leadership is based on this false premise that it actually takes talent to become a leader, and that that accolade of individual success, individual career success that is assigned to someone when they become a boss, a manager, a senior manager, or a leader, actually aligns or is in sync with the ability to add value, the ability to turn a group of people into a high-performing team, the ability to contribute to the progress of an organization and an institution. And that assumption is one we need to challenge. Because if your starting premise is that in order to get more people to the top, or people who have historically been marginalized or who haven't had access to the top, we need to look at what the people at the top actually look like. So basically, we would just find a copycat or lookalikes and say, okay, well, what a boss is like, and then based on that premise, let's look at who else could become one. Then you're starting in the wrong place, and you're going to end up in the wrong place. This, in fact, is one of the main problems and flaws with attempts to apply algorithms, artificial intelligence, or machine learning approaches to selecting future leaders, that they learn from incumbents. And if you train algorithms to predict who in a company or organization is likely to get promoted or to get to the top, it shouldn't surprise us that in a tech company, middle-aged white male engineers will over-index. In an average corporation, people with strong political skills and who are a little bit ruthless and Machiavellian and self-centered and narcissistic over-index in the leadership ranks. And that in academia, actually in academia, there are no politics and leader selection is perfect. So we can leave that as an exception. Sorry, I'm being a little bit cynical, but academia is no different than other institutions, right? In fact, it is still the case that in academia, in academic leadership, Or in academia, organizations are more meritocratic because at least we have all these metrics that we can use to judge track record, value, performance. You can adjust their weighting based on what the organization does. So the bigger problem is that actually it's often a de-incentive to become a manager or administrator or a boss, because it stops you from doing what you actually want to do, which is usually not so much teaching, but doing research and advancing, thinking in your field. So that, in a sense, is not the Peter principle, which is what my book talks about, that most people end up stagnating or climbing up to their own level of incompetence. And that's especially true for men, less so for women. But in academia, what you have would be the Bartleby principle, described by the Bartleby columnist in The Economist, which is that eventually we all rise to our own level of job misery, because we're put or shifted or switched from jobs we enjoyed to jobs we enjoy less. But we need to understand that the typical performance or the model performance of a leader in any field, organization, sector, institution is far from good. And I used to bombard people with charts and statistics showing that 1 in 2 bosses will fail, that 60 or 70% of CEOs will leave before their tenure is over, that the vast majority of toxic, counterproductive work behaviors and bullying, harassment, etc., that occurs in organizations, so dark side and destructive behaviors, are usually attributed to a small proportion of employees and a large proportion of managers or bosses, people with power. And of course, year after year, we have data showing that only 13% of people are engaged, that so only 13% of the workforce love their job, like their job, and care about their job or career. If you haven't read BS Jobs, Bullshit Jobs, that's a modern kind of expanded version of that. So you should consult it. And by the way, that engagement data, employee engagement data, that same studies that show that the number one motivator or demotivator of someone's job is their direct line manager or boss or leader, that data comes from people who are actually skilled. They're part of the knowledge economy, and they work in organizations that actually care about how they feel about their job. And yet, bad management and bad leadership is an epidemic, driving high levels of disengagement and high levels of underperformance at work. So this is very important, because if you're interested in gender diversity and your starting point is, how can women become more like men and therefore get to be leaders? What you're going to do in the best case scenario is promote women who replicate a flawed formula or profile for leadership, is to promote people who are more self-centered than other-oriented, who are in it for their own success, who are driven. And of course, there are a lot of studies and a lot of research also on the double-bind effect, that typically a lot of gender diversity interventions point the finger at women for not behaving like men or not displaying assertive masculine traits. And when they do, they are punished for it because they don't conform or fit in traditional kind of parameters or archetypes of femininity. But the women that do climb up the ladder and ascend in traditional male normative environments and institutions actually often out-male males in masculinity. So they look a lot more like Margaret Thatcher from a personality profile than a transformative, inspirational, and altruistic leader that you would think from the research or evidence-based approaches of what leaders should look like, whether they're male or female, they would look like. So first assumption is important to challenge. Most leaders are actually not good at their job, and most leaders are not selected for their leadership talent. The second issue that I write about and that explains why so many incompetent people, this first part attributes or is assigned to people in general, become leaders, has to do with the traits we actually select for and the gap between the traits we look for and the traits we should actually have. So typically, we focus a lot more on confidence instead of competence. And we're also more likely to select people on the basis of their charisma rather than their humility. And we're a lot more likely to select people on the basis of their narcissism as opposed to their integrity. And actually, there are known gender differences that have been documented, not just by my colleagues and myself, but by a lot of people in the field of organizational psychology and individual differences over the past 2 or 3 decades, showing that on average, there are significant gender differences in confidence, in charisma, and in narcissism. Charisma is the most controversial one because it shows that actually we attribute charisma to someone if they already fit the model or the persona that has historically been associated with status or power. So being more attractive, being part of the in-group in terms of socioeconomic status or race or gender, which explains the male bias here, or the fact that male over-index as charismatic leaders, if you ask people, then people will say, aha, this person is charismatic, I can connect with them, they're warm, etc. And even though charisma can be coached to some degree, it's far easier to exhibit and far more likely to be attributed to someone who is part of the in-groups. Confidence is the biggest one. And, I grew up in Argentina where we specialize in overconfidence. I have witnessed firsthand growing up, what consequences there are when you live in a system, in a society, in a nation that is so obsessed with confidence at the expense of competence that, in our own minds, in the minds of Argentines, we're still at the center of the universe and we're still one of the richest nations in the world, which we were 120 years ago or so. And yet we're the only perpetually declining nation in the world. Why? Because our self-beliefs, our self-delusions of talent have no correlation or no connection whatsoever with our actual performance, with our actual achievements, with our actual competence. And actually, this is something that an effect that might be exaggerated in Argentina and to some degree in the US, although, how fast the US might decline is to be determined, but it's true also factually that they haven't really been the dominant empire in the world for even 100 years. So, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very short empire. But in general, when you look at the correlation between any measure of confidence and any measure of actual competence, which is what you need to do to understand whether there are any advantages or whether there is any justifiable reason to select people on the basis of confidence, the correlation is about 0.3. So basically, there's 9% overlap between how good people think they are at something and how good they actually are at something. Which means that when you select people on the basis of confidence, you're going to end up with a lot of people who think they're good, but they're not very good at something. And that's especially the case in leader selection, because leadership talent is very hard to evaluate or to measure in an intuitive way. And typically we trust our instincts. So we sit in front of someone, and when they are charismatic or even narcissistic because they talk a lot and they seem very assertive and they're very good at self-promotion, and actually they are the epitome of the so-called lean in paradigm of leadership, we go, wow, they must be good because they think they're good, or they seem to be, quite pleased with themselves. But the reality is that most people who are pleased with themselves are unjustifiably pleased with themselves and unaware of their limitations. And leadership selection is based on signals and on methodologies that actually select for people who are fearless, reckless, confident, overconfident, and unaware of the limitations. So we judge our politicians and our future heads of states, prime ministers, and leaders based on how entertaining they are and based on how funny they are in a 2-minute presidential debate. It doesn't matter how many fact-checking feeds and sites there are out there. We still want to decide in 30 seconds or 1 minute whether someone should be trusted to lead our nation or our country. And in corporate selection or organizational selection, we go by somebody's ability to seduce us in a job interview, and whether they say the right things and whether they do eye contact and whether they seem to look like the incumbents. And so if you bet, or so long as we bet on confidence rather than competence, narcissism rather than integrity, and charisma rather than humility, it should not surprise us that too many incompetent people become leaders, and that too many of those individuals will be men rather than female, because male over-index in measures of overconfidence, charisma, and narcissism. So I think that's basically the essence to the book. And before we dive into the Q&A part, and please keep the questions coming. I see there's questions at least in the chat, and maybe there is a Q&A function that I'm missing, but if not, put your questions somewhere and we'll address them. What this means for diversity inclusion, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs, which I think are mostly well-meaning, but fundamentally also mostly flawed, because they are based on the assumption, a very outdated assumption coming from the 1960s or 1970s, that the unequal distribution of gender in the leadership ranks has to do with gender differences in willingness to become a leader, or in possessing or having the traits that actually predispose for effective leadership. And it is no longer the case that the average person, at least in the industrialized or developed world, would willingly admit that they believe that men are better leaders than women, but they most likely still think that gender differences in ambition, in the interest or desire to be a leader, are in essence responsible. So, somehow they assume, or there's still a kind of misconception or dominant stereotype or archetype that somehow women self-exclude themselves or self-select themselves out of leadership roles, because it's far more interesting to be tasked with unpaid labor at home, and attach ourselves to 1950s or 1850s societal roles. That's surely far more palatable than being part of the status elite or group of power that actually drives progress in organizational institutions. So what the data actually shows is no gender differences in willingness to be a leader, which in a way is almost irrational, with all the restrictions they are and all the difficulties and the extra hurdles that women face to get to be leaders. Why wouldn't they be less interested in being leaders? And yet you see no differences, no gender differences in desire to lead or to aspire to leadership roles. And the part that I spent 20 years researching and exploring, and I first started investigating during my PhD, but then have done so in various contexts and through various programs, and looking at both corporate and non-corporate data, organizational data on leaders. When we actually look at the attributes, the qualities that make leaders more effective, not those that actually make people leaders, but the qualities that make leaders more effective, things like self-awareness, humility, emotional intelligence, an altruistic orientation, even social curiosity, and self-control, as well as absence of dark side traits like psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, women perform better than men. In other words, and this is the main implication for gender diversity programs, that the best approach or the best intervention to improve the distribution or representation of women in leadership, in other words, the best gender diversity intervention would be to focus on talent and ignore gender. Because if we selected leaders as we taste wine in a sort of blind wine tasting process or competition or evening, we would not only end up with more women in leadership, but also more women than men in leadership. In other words, for most of the traits that improve leadership effectiveness or leadership performance, women have a slight advantage vis-a-vis men. And yet what happens is that the average D&I intervention or gender diversity intervention is still really drilling down or echoing Sheryl Sandberg's lean in approach, pointing the finger at women for not putting themselves forward, which A, doesn't really happen, or when it happens is because of lack of opportunities and clear restrictions, or no invitation, or no real opportunities. And in a real world, shouldn't really matter. Since when is the ability to think highly of yourself or put yourself forward for something an indication of how good you actually are at something? In fact, there is a famous Plato line that says, only those who don't seek power should be allowed to hold it. And I think this is a far better approach to leader selection than saying, let's see who has the loudest voice and who puts themselves forward or who leans in. Much of this advice, in fact, much of the advice that underpins gender diversity interventions inadvertently perpetuates gender stereotypes and gender biases that should be regarded as benevolent sexism today. In fact, it is my hope that if the field of gender diversity and of leadership and management sciences continues to evolve, even at the slow pace that it has evolved over the past 50 years, in 20 or 30 years' time, we will look back at Lean In and to Sheryl Sandberg's and see that these were signs of benevolent sexism. And the same can be said for any mainstream kind of intervention, even well-meaning self-help kind of coaching advice or interventions targeted at women, which is very much designed to not just point the finger at women, but asking women to behave more like men, and specifically more like incompetent men. So the solution to gender diversity, according to these interventions, is to encourage more women to speak up when they have nothing to say, to raise their hand when they have nothing to say in a meeting, to apply for jobs when they are not qualified for those jobs, and to bullshit their way up and self-promote as incompetent men did and do successfully. And there are two main reasons why that is a mistaken approach. One, the best case scenario is that it doesn't work for women. So we wasted their time and energy, but then they end up feeling imposter syndrome and like frauds and, oh my God, I couldn't fix myself. And the worst case scenario is that we get the wrong women to the top, women that actually resemble incompetent men, which will perpetuate or even enhance gender stereotypes. So, I think it would be helpful if organizations start with a clear understanding of the problem they're trying to fix, whether it's representation, whether it's diversity, whether it's inclusion, but also pay more attention to evaluating and understanding the inadvertent consequences and implications, the undesired, unintentional implications of some of the actions that they have in place. And I will finish with a line from a very generous line in the Guardian review of my book by Oliver Berkman, who basically said, after reading the book, that surely the solution to a world run by overconfident fools is not to make the other half of the world overconfident too, which I think is a very good synopsis or critique of our current gender diversity interventions. They're not just wrong in the sense that they're trying to fix women and point the finger at women, who, by the way, might actually improve the quality of leaders, but also perpetuate the assumption that our leaders should continue to look like the leaders we have. And until we don't change that, we will continue to see and experience this unpleasant and uncomfortable gap between the leaders we need and the leaders we actually get. So thank you very much. I'll open it up now for the Q&A. And I hope this was interesting enough kind of introduction or sort of prequel to it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomas. What a challenge you've handed us. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective, and it's definitely very thought-provoking. I think we need to all be looking for those people who don't seek power and working out what to do. So we have lots of questions coming in. So Thank you very much. That was most enjoyable. What we're going to do is I'm going to hand over. We're going to have a panel of people who will ask questions, and we've got a Q&A where people, so everyone who's watching can upvote questions. If they look at the questions, they can click on the thumbs up, and we can try and filter the most popular questions to the top, and we'll just take it in turns to read them out. And starting I think with Rahia.
Hi, Tomas. Thanks very much for that question, for that talk. So I've been monitoring the questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to, my first question will be a sort of summary of quite a few of the questions, which is, and I know that you talk about this in your book a lot, which is how do you actually design metrics to assess competent versus incompetent leadership? So can you tell us a bit about where you think, how you think we can improve those things?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And, the goal is always to try to predict something, right? And we're trying to predict how somebody will lead and how somebody will behave when they assume a role that they didn't have before. Because, when it comes to predicting the performance of very experienced or seasoned leaders, you don't need assessment, you don't need data, you don't need tools, you don't need an expert. You can safely assume that past performance will continue to replicate. And as we know, this, as we say in kind of organizational psychology, past performance is the best predictor of future performance. Because even though we're not squirrel or fish or as predictable as some of the other species that you study in zoology, we still are creatures of habit. And when somebody has been doing the same for 5, 10, 15 years, you can assume that that will replicate. So now the interesting question is how you can make that prediction when someone has never led, right? So if you are an employee, or you are just a student, or you are just a, normal citizen and I want to evaluate your leadership, your potential, which means to predict how well you perform as a leader, what do I need to do? And there you always have input and output. Input is the signals that you try to capture, and then it's really a more complex version of a correlation or regression, but you build models trying to identify how good certain signals predict the outcomes. And one of those signals, by the way, is gender, right? So we care about whether, and so in our research, we always had information, data sets that had gender, even though 70 or sometimes 80% of the leaders in the data set were men, but we could still look at whether gender played a difference. And then you look at all these other things, soft skills, expertise, hard skills, personality, values, interview performance, and so on and so on and so on. The input part is relatively easy, but one of the biggest challenges, which is what I discuss in my book, is the unreliability of the output part. Because most of the times, if you walk into an organization and you say, I'm interested in helping you predict leadership performance, and you try to reverse engineer the attributes or factors that explain why some people got to the top, you're actually going to predicting a popularity contest or a political contest, because that's not performance, that's emergence, right? And so the number one opportunity to do this better is to actually decontaminate or debias your measures of performance, to ensure that for the people who are going to be your benchmark, you actually have information of the value they add. So I want to know what their employees think of them. I want to know whether teams are engaged. I want to know how productive and effective their teams are compared to others. I want to know whether they engage in counterproductive work behaviors, acts of incivility, unethics, etc. And the more data you gather to actually have historical data on the signals that differentiate between high performance and low performance, the easier it is for you then to predict with these signals how to do it. And then basically you're left with just two questions. What should I assess and how? The what is always a combination of good technical expertise and good experience with a combination of certain soft skills, intelligence, curiosity, empathy, emotional intelligence, resilience, self-awareness, self-control, coachability, and then if you can have humility, you hit the jackpot. Nobody has these 10 things, but the more you have of these markers, the more your potential increases. And then how you assess them. And on the how, we need to de-emphasize the weighting, the importance, or the attention we give to our own intuition. Intuition is a bit like sense of humor. You know, if you ask people, are you intuitive? 90% of people will tell you yes, but how many people are actually intuitive? Well, you know, the 5 or 10% who actually spend a lifetime making their intuition more data-driven because they work very hard and they develop expertise. And by the way, the problem is they're often not within that 90% that tells you I'm intuitive, because the more you know about a subject, the more self-critical and the more humble you become.
Great, thank you. Michael, do you want to come in with a question?
Sure. Thanks so much for the talk. It's fantastic to learn more about everything that you're doing. So following along the lines of how do we assess a good leader, it seems like that quite a number of people are asking, once we have done the assessment, if it's clear that they're not a good leader, how can we intervene in order to try and make them a better leader? Or is the solution simply to axe them out of the system? And is there a better approach? And how successfully has any organization really gone about implementing either of these or some other third approach?
Yes, I think I counted 5 questions in one, but I'll try to kind of bundle them together. And I think, look, it's really, 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 really important to understand that. So, you know, you have selection and you have development. So first you appoint people and then you develop them. To give you an idea, for those of you who are not in the corporate world of organizations, the budgets, the HR budgets that organizations have are about 85% or 90% of the talent management budgets are for learning, training, and development, and 10 or 50% are for selection. And I always say, you know, when selection fails, there's always training and development. But we need to understand that in a logical world, it should be the other way around. Development, training, and learning or coaching, executive coaching included, is often remedial, is there to fix an issue that could have been prevented if you selected the right persons to begin with. And actually, when you select the right people, they will be coached and develop and learn really, really well. So, you know, this is one of the paradoxes of the world of executive coaching, that it works best with those who need it the least. Because if you're open to feedback and you listen and you want to get better and you're curious and you're coachable, then you probably didn't need coaching as much as those who are uncoachable. Now, now that doesn't mean that when you have someone with low potential, you have to run away or just eject them or discard them. You know, it might be that they're still the best of the candidates that you have, or that they have some strengths that are very important. And, you know, it's rarely black or white. It's usually a matter, you know, the best thing that good assessment or data-driven tools can tell you is how this person will behave and how they will lead. So, you know, if that model is useful and predictive, then you can use it to sort of tailor and design a long-term development or training intervention that actually expands their potential and their capabilities. And so now, one of the other problems is that a lot of the things that are done in leadership development and training are actually counterproductive, right? So for example, the world, especially the Western world and America, loves strengths-based coaching. So, you know, so if a leader is confident, you're going to make them overconfident. Or if somebody is, you know, has good political skills, you'll turn them into a politician. No, you know, you only develop by working on your flaws. The fact that in the corporate world and in much of the HR world, we cannot even use the word flaws now. You know, people have strengths and opportunities, you know, which is the euphemism of the century. It's like, I really like this candidate. Will they be a good leader? Well, they don't have many strengths, but they have a lot of opportunities. Do you have anyone with fewer opportunities, right? And so the fact that you can't even use the word flaws is indicative or symptomatic of how diluted some of these efforts are. And don't even get me started with the authenticity problem, because this idea that the best leaders are just themselves and that they can just, you know, somehow bring their whole selves to work and behave in uncensored, uninhibited, and unfiltered ways, and that this sort of approach, entitled approach to being a boss, is what we want. I mean, that's exactly the kind of behaviors that explains the Harvey Weinsteins, the Jeffrey Epsteins, and the Bernie Madoffs of this world, and any other instance of a powerful senior leader who actually engages in toxic and parasitic behavior. I always feel when I'm in the presence of biologists or zoologists, I should use parasitic as much as possible, because that's the best way to describe some of these human approaches to leadership.
Wow, thank you. How interesting. Yeah, we're all very familiar with parasites and the parasitic lifestyle. So I think that I'm going to choose a question because quite a few of the questions that are very highly voted have been answered already as we've been discussing. I'm going to take a question which has 5 votes, and it says, thank you for your talk. It has shed a lot of light on previous unpleasant experiences with management. While we are still in working environments that promote people with dark traits such as narcissism, etc., how do we work under these people effectively?
Yeah, so just written together with my Harvard colleague, Amy Edmondson, who is the pioneer and sort of the grande dame of psychological safety. So her research writes a lot about how good leaders create safety in their teams, environments where people feel free to speak up, even if it is with difficult comments and conversations, and where, especially when you don't belong to the in-group, you feel included and that your opinion matters, right? So she has done a lot of research on that, and I, of course, spent a lot of time researching bad leadership or toxic leadership. And for a while, we've been collaborating, trying to combine both things, because lack of psychological safety is one of the major kind of markers of an arrogant boss or an incompetent boss. And we just written an article, a short kind of popular article for Fast Company that was out this Monday on how to deal with an arrogant boss, which also talks about this. So, running away or trying to find a new boss aren't the only alternatives, although they are obvious alternatives. In that article, we talk about some of the things, the tactics and the strategies that you can engage in order to at least improve your relationship with them and not kind of massacre or impair your own career chances. And so confronting them is never a good idea. Providing them with a reality check, which a much needed reality check, is a very dangerous strategy. This is like basically level 5 challenge for anyone in an organization, is how to deal with a bad boss and actually try to improve the relationship or improve them. But there are certain things that you can do. So for example, helping them advance their own agenda, even if that means advancing their own success, so long that that isn't violating basic ethical or moral principles, can turn you into an ally. Helping them understand how they are seen by others, so just being a messenger of some of the things that they might have missed about their own reputation could be useful. And of course, in some instances, just going outside of that dyad and trying to enlist champions that are more senior to them and going beyond is a very practical and commonsensical approach. But yeah, you can read more about it. It's a very difficult situation. We know that a lot of people change jobs because they've been traumatized by their previous boss. We know that actually most people start their own businesses or enter in self-employment because they've had very bad, unpleasant experience with their previous line managers. But there's of course no guarantee that if you keep trying, at some point you're going to have a really great boss, even if statistically that's likely to happen. And of course, in general, people are more satisfied when they work for themselves than when they work for someone else, not just because they don't have a boss, but because also it's a lot harder to complain about your boss when your boss is yourself, right? So that's somewhat of a kind of a self-selection bias there, I would say.
Thanks, Tomas. Rahia.
Sure. So a lot of the work that you do is about how we don't really perceive the right qualities in leadership. Our instincts are to select for those who are overconfident. What do you think is like the quickest and easiest way to change people's preconceptions of what the characteristics of a good leader should be?
So this is a really good question, Rahia. And I think, the opportunity, and I mean a real opportunity, not a flaw, but the actual kind of a potential or the kind of the half full part of the glass, is also the biggest irritation and the biggest problem, which is that I think conceptually people understand it, right? So when I tell people, look, and even, you know, during the pandemic, I've been writing a lot about pandemic leadership and crisis leadership. And, you know, my conclusion generally is that in a normal or logical world, we wouldn't have needed a pandemic to realize that people are generally better off when their leaders are smart, kind, and you know, and humble and curious. But in our world, we somehow did, because especially in the first 6 months, we were like, wow, look, actually it matters if you have a really inept leader, or if you have a really good one, or at least one who is humble and cares. So I think still conceptually or theoretically, there's not much controversy there, right? When I tell people that the research generally shows that attributes like intelligence and curiosity and humility and you know, and integrity and emotional intelligence or resilience matters, no one says, no, I think arrogance is much more important, or you know, sort of a kind of being corrupt is much better. No one challenges the constructs or the attributes on a theoretical level. And yet there is not much change in the leaders we actually get. So I think the issue is not challenging the biases that people have, or even the fact that we have biases about what we need or what the attributes are, but to challenge the belief that we can actually select on these traits and that we're very good at judging them, you know. And I think in that sense, it's controversial, but the number one sort of possibility or opportunity to improve is to actually decrease the role or the influence that humans have in the process, right? So when I say to make it gender blind or race blind or age blind, or, you know, very few people actually talk about social class. I know more so in the UK than in other places, but social class is the mother of all biases. And it's very easy to train an algorithm or AI to ignore whether someone comes from a privileged or underprivileged background, whether someone is rich or poor. In fact, you know, even if it weren't the case that it's easy to train them, we have to understand that unlike humans, AI doesn't care if you're rich or poor, but humans do. So I think, you know, removing humans from the selection is the number one opportunity. And I always go back to remember, you know, when I was doing my PhD, my flatmate, who was a German computer scientist, remembered late on a Sunday evening that he had to vote for the German elections. And he said, oh, I have to vote. I said, who are you going to vote for? I said, oh, I don't know. And this was, you know, 2003 or so. And he went on a website, answered 50 questions about, you know, his views on the economy, tax, health, policies, etc. And it was a simple survey. And after 5 minutes, it said, you should vote for this candidate, Angela Merkel, right? And, you know, I thought, wow, this is such a hyper-rational approach to picking our leaders, which is what you would expect anywhere. But despite the fact that you can be really educated and we have this, you know, richness of information and data, it seems that we want to be more and more tribal and more intuitive in our selection, which is why it doesn't matter how many live fact-checking feeds there are in a presidential or prime ministerial debate. We don't care. We make our decisions according, you know, to a couple of minutes intuitive kind of preferences, which I think is explained very clearly in evolutionary terms, because for 99% of our evolutionary history, leadership dependent on very easily observable attributes such as strengths or pace or courage. And also, we spent most of our life with the same 20 people who we knew really, really well. So I think our archaic, ape-like, and, you know, ancestral brains still cling to this illusion that we can see leadership when we have someone in front of us, that we know it when we see it, but the world has gotten a little bit more complex, and we need to be humble enough and self-aware enough to realize that we just can't do this by ourselves.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got 9 minutes left before we are going to close, so I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. Michael, you got one prepared?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
we're going to lose a lot of the questions because there's lots of fantastic questions and we can't ask them all. Michael.
Yes, it's many to survey. Yeah, thanks everyone. Quite a lot of them look like that they're looking at concrete things to do during a hiring process. So I'm looking at one from an anonymous attendee who says, so what questions are frequently asked that should not be being asked when you're hiring someone new and looking for leadership?
Look, it's difficult to provide a short answer to this because there's so many, right? But I would say, and off the top of my head, avoid the kind of brain teasers that have become very famous in Silicon Valley, both the sector and the place and the TV show, right? How many tennis balls can you fit in a 747 or that? Actually, there is research showing that the only thing that those questions predicts is that the interviewer is sadistic himself or herself, right? Which is a very interesting paper. Then avoid focusing too much on past performance, so tell me about an instance where you did this or that, etc. Because either that information you can get through the track record, or it's irrelevant when you're actually trying to predict whether someone has the potential to do something they haven't done before. And the last one is more of a conceptual one. Forget about culture fit if you truly care about diversity, gender diversity or otherwise. And this might not happen so much in academia as in other sectors, but in most sectors, especially the corporate sector, the same organizations that are celebrating and glorifying diversity tell you that they love hiring for culture fit, and the two are mutually exclusive. You cannot simultaneously augment or harness increased diversity and hire for culture fit. By definition, not belonging to the ruling elite is what diversity needs to do. And if you hire the people that always fit in the past, then don't expect any change. And quite frankly, you can expect to die a relatively slow but steady death, because that's the kind of cognitive decline that happens to organizations when they suffer from groupthink, when they can't innovate, and when everyone says the same or thinks the same. And by the way, I always say there's a reason why culture and cult have the same roots.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting perspective, and you're absolutely right, aren't you, about the culture and diversity thing? Yeah, I think that we'll leave the final question over to Rahia.
So this is sort of going back to the discussion that we had about how do you change people's perceptions of what leadership should look like. This is probably not going to come as news to you, but there's a lot of unease about your title, right? Because it is very different from lean in messages, and it just kind of goes for the jugular, really. So I was wondering if part of the issue with changing the perceptions of what leadership looks like is that currently who holds power is what you're sort of fighting against. And so why do you think that there is such a unease about this title, and how do you really kind of get to
look, I think
because it requires sort of work from leaders, right, as well as people who aren't leaders yet.
Yeah, look, I think the title is provocative. I think it's deliberately provocative. I think most of the book's content is very unprovocative and commonsensical, because it's a book about what good leadership should look like. But the implications are more provocative than the title, because they are that we currently don't have a meritocracy, and that we have in place. So when people tell me, oh, this is BS, I think the best person should get the job, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of whether they're male or female, I always say, me too, wouldn't that be nice? And that's the part that is actually traumatic and that hurts, because if you're telling people that what they have in place is crooked or unfair and actually ineffective, and that it defies the very spirit of capitalism, then they at least have a big cognitive dissonance. And it's so, I think that's more provocative. I would also say that I think that you can't fight a big battle or a war just by being nice. And even though, I never considered myself a feminist, now I probably do, but I never did. And, I grew up in a very chauvinistic country. I feel that I have a responsibility for being part of this perhaps soon to be extinguished demographic species called the middle-aged white male, to actually say things from where I am. And, a lot of my colleagues who are very extraordinary and productive and prolific academic or practitioner women, feminists, they still complain to me, saying, you realize they're only listening to you because you are a charismatic white man, which I find is a very interesting paradox, because it implies that I am correct as well, I am true as well, right? So that the content of the book is true, but that also dismisses the importance of the content, because it's who says it, right? So look, I think you need to make people uncomfortable, and you need to fight back, and you can't just do it by being nice. And I also think that a lot of the pushback is not because of what I say or the title, but it's because people are seeing that some progress is actually happening. And those who are the ruling elite, of course, feel threatened by these changes, even though everyone will benefit when women have equal access to employment and when there's more female leaders, because a society that is more balanced and that has more female leaders is a better society for everyone, not just for women. So that's a very stupid kind of tribal misconception. But at the end of the day, Rahia, I think, I'm very skeptical about the people that you can truly convince and the minds you can truly change. I think the book, much like anything I've written before that has had some impact, provides some ammunition and comfort to people who already agreed with it before and will be safely ignored by most of the others. And the people in between, maybe you can persuade some, but it's a minority, right? And there is a 7 or 8 year lag between the article with that title and the book with that title, because the publisher said to me, we can't publish this, 70 or 80% of our readers are male executives, you can't insult them. And I kept on telling them for 7 years, don't worry, they won't realize that it's about them. And in fact, to this day, they have not. They say, I really liked your book. I know a lot of people who are like that. So, that's the beauty of not having self-awareness. Ignorance is bliss.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic session that's been. Thank you, Tomas, for your time. And we've had 300 or so people here listening, and all of us in zoology massively appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. I know I'm very sorry to those who haven't been able to have their question asked, because there's lots of other questions in the question list. I would like to say thank you very much, but I'd also like to end with something that Emma posted on the chat quite early on, which is to say this is really relevant to what's going on in Glasgow this week. And she posted a tweet which says, the patriarchy seems abstract until we realise that the future of humanity rests this week almost exclusively in the hands of men. So I thought it'd be good to close with that. Thank you so much. It's been really great to have you. And thanks for listening, everyone else.
Thank you.
Goodbye.